I can't believe our son is gay. Where did we go wrong?
How could you choose to live this way? What's wrong with you? No son of mine is gonna be... You're gonna rot in hell. Get out of our house. You are dead to me.
There is a current crisis in our country of a rising homeless LGBTQ+ youth population. LGBTQ+ youth account for only 5 to 10% of the youth population, but 40% of homeless youth. The current legislation, the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, fails to address LGBTQ+ youth and is lacking in many ways. Passing new legislation or amending current legislation to redistribute funding and restructure homeless youth programs will solve for discrimination in shelter homes and other homeless services, and will guarantee protections for LGBTQ+ youth and reduce the amount of youth participating in survival sex, and will provide shelter and programs with resources they need to aid LGBTQ+ youth. There is a problem in the current system with discrimination against LGBTQ+ youth. Passing or amending legislation to restructure homeless youth shelters and services will include the restructuring of funding, training, and discrimination policies.
According to a Williams Institute study in 2015, we found that is one of the leading causes for why LGBTQ youth will not or do not access services from homeless service providers is there is provider prejudice.
In 2019, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services announced that they would no longer be enforcing protection for discrimination against homeless youth on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. Therefore, we have to include language in our legislation that will protect homeless LGBTQ+. The Runaway and Homeless Youth and Trafficking Prevention Act of 2019 does exactly this. According to the fact sheet, the bill prohibits discrimination on the basis of actual or perceived race, color, religion, national origin, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, or disability. Here in Dallas, 38% of homeless LGBTQ+ youth have reported that they feel unsafe at local shelters.
You're not sure if you're going to be accepted. You always have that doubt in the back of your mind.
The cause of some of these injustices is legislative invisibility, the phenomenon when certain groups of people are not considered when drafting certain laws and policies. Providing safe spaces for homeless LGBTQ+ youth is the key to solving the structural discrimination that homeless LGBTQ+ youth face. Pushing federally funded programs to be LGBTQ+ inclusive will alleviate the overflow of youth needing safe housing.
I feel that it's got me pretty far.
Hammer says he did find acceptance in the local service providers.
Whether it is contacting our local and state legislators or raising awareness in our communities, stopping discrimination within these systems will provide homeless LGBTQ+ youth with the housing needed to protect them from the dark harms of living on the street. Survival sex is a form of prostitution in which one exchanges sexual favors for basic necessities such as food, clothing, and shelter.
Survival sex is one of those terms that is not talked a lot about within the broader conversation of human trafficking, but we see a lot specifically with our LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness.
Survival sex in the homeless LGBTQ+ youth community stems from a variety of problems. The lack of money to support LGBTQ+ shelters, the lack of space and beds in those shelters, and the lack of laws to protect homeless or runaway LGBTQ+ youth. Because they lack protections from shelter discrimination or rejection due to their sexual orientation or their gender identity, homeless LGBTQ+ youth are forced to live in the streets. In addition, a lack of shelter space in many areas nationwide leave a large number of homeless youth without a place to stay. With no other means of survival, many turn to survival sex.
There's an overlap with sex trafficking. There's an overlap with similar, on the other side of the coin, work trafficking.
Amending legislation to guarantee protections for homeless LGBTQ+ youth would reduce the amount of youth participating in survival sex by providing them the basic necessities that they would instead exchange sexual favors for. By providing homeless LGBTQ+ youth with basic needs in a safe and open environment, the need for survival sex can be drastically reduced. government funding will provide for more shelter space, given that LGBTQ+ youth take up the majority of the homeless youth population. Inclusivity of the LGBTQ+ community in laws and legislation will secure and ensure the safety and protections that they deserve. Amending legislation to fund and restructure current homeless youth programs to support homeless LGBTQ+ youth would be too expensive. Other federally funded programs such as international affairs, energy and environment receive less money than the proposed programs would receive. Money required to make these programs possible is unreasonably high in comparison to other pressing matters. The funds available wouldn't be able to pay for the programs and resources directed to LGBTQ+ homeless youth without infringing on funds for other programs that provide support for other homeless populations in America, such as women who have escaped abuse and would also be in need of similar resources. According to nationalpriorities.org, $61.48 billion of federal funds were spent on housing and community in 2015. This money goes to multiple different organizations, programs, and federally funded resources that are meant to aid the homeless crisis in America. According to TrueColorUnited.org, in an article written by Justin Rush, a director of public policy, there have already been increases in funds directed to aiding the LGBTQ+ homeless youth population. Creating shelters specific to LGBTQ+ youth would leave out a large part of the homeless population, thus making the increase in funds specific to LGBTQ+ unreasonable. Amending legislation to provide resources and programs specific to the LGBTQ+ youth community in the U.S. would be a greedy use of federal funds. These funds are also used to protect other homeless communities apart from the LGBTQ+ youth. The funds and resources currently available are sufficient enough. Although programs exist to help homeless youth, without specific language identifying and validating the distinct problems LGBTQ+ youth face, there is no way to ensure enforcement and coverage. Amending legislation to fund and restructure the current youth homeless programs will provide shelter and programs with resources they need to aid these youth, including specialized training for workers to better understand how to help these youth and funding for basic services and to expand the reach of these programs. There are three main categories for programs: the Basic Center Grant Program, the Transitional Living Program, and the Street Outreach Program, with its subset, the Sexual Abuse Prevention Program. Currently, only a fraction of homeless youth benefit from these programs, especially LGBTQ+ youth. This is because these programs mean nothing without funding. The additional funding will not only allow for more youth being able to benefit from these programs, but will also provide training to staff and provide the youth with mental health care. LGBTQ+ youth compose between 30% and 43% of those served by drop-in centers, street outreach programs, and housing programs, meaning that they are more affected by this. The lack of funding in many shelters results in them not being able to house many youth and leaves them at risk for the dangers they may experience on the streets.
In our homes, we're not free to be who we are. But the streets are a lot worse. You're killing us off.
A national survey found that the lack of funding, particularly government funding, was identified as the primary barrier to improving services related to reducing LGBT homelessness.
Up till now, the majority of our funding has been through a grant of a church, actually. Now we're working on other grants, but that's where our funding our main source of funding has been.
The amending of the legislation will allow for them to have access to the help they need.
We are no different from you. We bleed the same, cry the same, and hurt the same. We need these shelters that give us a place to be free and give us a second chance to live our lives. Sometimes all we need is that second chance.
This issue is affecting a large part of the homeless youth in the U.S., and the numbers continue to grow every year. The first step to making change is to donate to organizations committed to helping our current homeless LGBTQ+ youth population. You can also urge your representatives to consider the new bill that was proposed, the Runaway and Homeless Youth and Trafficking Prevention Act. Although legislation would reduce the number of youth on the street, the problem won't truly be over until people change their mindsets and become more accepting. The programs are not the ultimate solution. The only way for this to truly end is for parents to stop discrimination against their kids for being who they are. Until this happens, we need legislation to protect these youth.
Regardless, at the end of the day, they're still my child. I will still